So welcome everyone to our June Segal convening career chat with Daniel Pereira, who's Brandeis '08, on leveraging communications for social change and also his career journey. Daniel, we really appreciate you taking the time to share with us as a Brandeis alum and as someone who's really thought about how to make their career about social justice to come and talk with us. Daniel is the Director of Communications at MIRA, and he was previously the communications director at T1D Exchange, a Boston-based nonprofit that focused on better, longer lives for people with type 1 diabetes. So we're really happy that you'll share not only what it looks like to make a communications career be about social justice, Daniel, but also, we have a recent Brandeis grad on the phone, and some of the folks that wanted to watch the video later are really interested in hearing what you wanted to share about that career journey part too, because whether you're 1 year out or 10 years out or more, it can feel confusing to find your way on your path. So thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. So I said I'm Daniel Augusto Pereira. I am the Director of Communications for the MIRA Coalition, which is the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition. We're the largest immigrant refugee-focused nonprofit in Massachusetts, and we're really, more than just one group, a coalition, as the name suggests, of 140 different organizations all around, mostly Massachusetts, some of them in Connecticut or New Hampshire and Maine. And it brings together, a really broad range of labor unions, faith organizations, educational organizations, healthcare, nonprofits of all different descriptions to sort of unify, all the different priorities, all the different skills, all the different, communities that are, exist in the umbrella of immigrants and refugees in Massachusetts, which is, as some of you may or may not know, is one of the most immigrant, sort of centered communities and regions in the country. I think more than 30% of Boston is made up of immigrants from various nations. I myself am a first-generation immigrant from a Brazilian family. I was born here in Boston to parents who came to study here in the 80s. I grew up not far from Brandeis, actually, down in Watertown and Belmont area. And then I attended Brandeis after graduating from high school, and I studied English, creative writing, and journalism, because obviously I wanted to get rich. But I also studied abroad in Cairo for a while at the American University in Cairo, where I had an Arabic program, and it was another great experience that Brandeis was able to offer me. So, thanks to Susie, to everyone, to the Heller, for inviting me here today to speak. One thing I will say is that I'm not, by any means, the most expert person on immigration as a policy kind of piece, or I've experience of it personally from my family. I've been working at MIRA for 4 or 5 months. Before that, as Susie said, I was at the T1D Exchange, which is a type 1 diabetes focused nonprofit. But I have spent a great deal of my time since leaving Brandeis in communications, and I think that's part of what what brought me here, was actually spending a long time in what I would call the trenches of for-profit work, and that's what brought me to nonprofit work and to social justice and advocacy work. Was kind of almost forged from spending a long time working at content marketing firms, ghostwriting, doing things like that. And what I learned there informs a lot of what I know now, what I do now, and how I work now, both for better and sometimes also the things that I learned that were not so good, or that the negative experiences I had in that space. And so the one thing I do want to say is that if you're someone who is in creative work, and there are a lot of people who, at Brandeis, I was surrounded by people who love creative work. They love making music. They love writing. They love poetry. They love art. And then, a lot of us, I'm sure Jess can relate to this, but, graduating into the teeth of the recession in 2008 made a lot of us go, okay, well, now I got to pay the bills, and what do we do? And how do you make and build a life, in a city as expensive as Boston, but also give it meaning and give it purpose and do something that you can, be proud of and that you can feel good about at the end of the day. And so, I don't know where everyone is or has been on that journey, but, one thing I would say is that it's surprisingly never too late to change direction. I've changed direction a couple of times, and maybe I'll change direction again, but, I'm really happy with the direction changes that I have made and the choices that I did make to kind of, shift my own narrative in life. I've always been like, what brought me to Brandeis in the first place actually was the strength of its writing and its journalism programs, and this idea that's kind of been a through line for me, I think, for a lot of my life, professionally, personally, but like of storytelling and of narrative. I sat in some classes, I talked to professors, I talked to some students, and the idea that there were stories to be told, stories to be heard, to be listened to, and then to be written was a big part of what drove me through the whole thing. And I think part of immigration is that it's bringing all of these new stories, all of these people, all of these communities to one place or to different places together, and learning all the stories of people who have had really wildly different experiences. I mean, I'm Brazilian American, but I can go and meet with Brazilian American, the Brazilian Women's Group or Brazilian Workers Group, which are located down here, and their story of Brazilian immigration to a neighborhood next door to mine, very different from mine in a lot of ways, depending on how they came, when they came, are they documented, are they undocumented, what struggles do they face. And so being able to, tell those stories and share them is something that I'm really happy and sort of proud to be able to do now. But to rewind a little bit to explain, why I'm talking about for-profit work. So I graduated, as I said, in 2008. It was, right into the election and the teeth of the financial recession. And I spent a while I did some internships. I worked, odd jobs, waited tables, selling coffee at Starbucks, did different things. And eventually I did find some work ghostwriting because I did have a journalism background. I had done journalism at, at the Justice and at the Hoot, and then also abroad when I was in AUC. And that got me into this sort of new field called content marketing. And content marketing is basically ghostwriting on a mass level or a corporate level. A company will hire your company, and you write for whatever their field is, their industry. You basically create content. And so this was in the 2010, 2011, so it's still pretty nascent industry. It was still coming into its own, and you would get assigned a couple of clients and say, okay, write for their blog. Their blog could be about anything. It could be about tractors. It could be about commodities trading. It could be about digital security. And you had to kind of be quick on your feet and learn a lot of different things, and also write a great deal. I mean, we were writing a huge amount of content. And while I wouldn't recommend a lot about that job, it did teach me to write really, really fast. It was like being a beat reporter on a really tight deadline, where you had to get a lot of words down cleanly and accurately in a quick amount of time. So I worked for quite a while in that field at a couple of companies downtown in Boston. And I eventually did move up from a writing position to a management position. And I think that's kind of one of the things that started to shape my, not that I had not had any political interest before, but it shaped my political interest at the time, was going from the position of being a writer, being a worker, to managing writers and workers, and to seeing, how exactly the work of people like me was being translated into, organizations, was being translated into profits, was being translated into, management structures, and, a lot of what I didn't like about that. But I spent, longer than I should have doing that job, I think, and I'll admit that now. But I did try and make a point of always listening to what my teams and my writers were experiencing, and then trying to square that with, what kind of we were being told from the top, from the corporate level, was the goal, what were the ideals, what was the structure, and I think that anyone who's worked in a job where you have to produce units or something, on a factory line or at a retail or whatever, knows that there can be a real gap between what you're told is the goal of X per hour and what's actually humanly possible. So I spent quite a while trying to square that circle, in management, trying to, we didn't really have the structure to unionize at the time, but to try and at least, advocate for the workers that and the writers that we had. And so it was kind of a weird combination of like production line work, but also, creative work where you were expected, where the people who I was working with and the teams that I was working with in management were expected to, mass produce creative work, which is a very difficult combination of things to manage. And so eventually, I went from one company to a different company. I spent a little bit longer there. They restructured their whole organization, and I said, you know what, this is about 2018, 2017. I said, I've kind of had enough of this kind of work. I need to find something different. And so I was fortunate at that time that actually right across the street from me, there's a nonprofit called T1D Exchange. I mentioned at the beginning that I'm an immigrant or my family are immigrants from Brazil. I'm also a type 1 diabetic. I was diagnosed at the age of 16. So that's type 1, for people don't know, is insulin-dependent diabetes. Once you're diagnosed, you have to take insulin every day for the rest of your life. You have to check your blood sugar, several times a day now, fortunately, the process is a lot more technologically sophisticated and automated, but it used to be, pretty manual. And people would often wonder, at Brandeis, why am I carrying around a little pouch with syringes and vials and, like pricking myself every couple of hours and having to take juice box breaks in class and doing all those things. So, finding a place that they needed a communications director, they needed someone to manage, their digital presence. And a lot of what Type 1 Diabetes Exchange did was community building, but on the internet and as a digital organization. So Type 1 diabetes nonprofit dedicated to, as you said, better, longer lives for people with Type 1 diabetes. They do that in a couple of ways. One of them is through research. They recruit lots of diabetics and I should say, a lot of healthcare writing will now say people with diabetes because they always use person first language. In the diabetes community, most of us just say diabetics because we've been saying it our whole lives. So I apologize if anyone is annoyed by that, but that's just as a personal preference. Someone who's been diabetic, I just diabetic. But a big part of our goal there was to gather people together to kind of, every single diabetic or person with diabetes creates a huge amount of data every day, from our blood sugars, how much insulin we're taking, how much we're eating, all of this different stuff. And we, it's an enormous resource really, but a lot of it is just kind of lost to the ether, or it's individual in all these little places. And so part of what we were trying to do is create a digital online community of people with diabetes for two reasons. One, on the sort of the technical scientific side, quantitative side, to be able to do research and say, okay, what's working, what's not, what are the struggles, what are the successes, are people using these devices, is it helping them, or is it actually just more complexity for no, and more cost for no real gain in outcomes. And so, creating cohorts, doing research, doing longitudinal research is also super important because diabetes is a lifelong condition. So, how you manage it from age 16 to 26 is as important from 26 to 36 and so on and so on. And so you want to be able to get a hold of people at every stage of life. I mean, there are people out there who we recruited into these studies who were had been diagnosed with diabetes in the 1960s when the insulin was completely different, when everything was, a totally different world. And so, that was, fortunately, some of the groundwork had been laid there. But the thing that I tried to do the most there was, as I mentioned earlier, is storytelling, because there's a lot that you can say and a lot that you can talk about, but one of the things that I learned over the course of writing thousands and thousands of words for, all different types of organizations over the years is that you really kind of need, for most people, you need a story hook. You need something that people read and they say, I want to know more about that. I want to know, like, who is that person? Why did that happen to them? What did they do? And a lot of the stuff that, I mean, if you imagine how many thousands of words, how many pages do you look by every single day as you're going, on the internet, there's clickbait, there's ads, and you have an ad block, and maybe you don't, there's you're on Twitter, you're on Facebook, you're on LinkedIn, you're on Instagram. There's an immense amount of stuff, and you need to be able to, tell a story, tell it quickly, because I mean, unfortunately, our attention spans are a bit fragmented in this era, and tell it quickly, and then bring someone in to do something. A call to action, whether it could be join a study, it could be just follow a newsletter, it could be get involved in an action, actual in demonstration, or and how much you want people to do will change the kind of stories you need to tell. But I think a lot of people think, oh, if we just put it out there, or if we just put it out there and put money behind it, it'll do the job. But you actually really need a compelling story, and you also need people who know and understand what they're talking about, because especially with the diabetes thing, I could see, I could tell when an ad targeted at diabetics, or a research study opportunity targeted diabetics hadn't really been consulted with someone who was actually diabetic. There's a disconnect there. It's not to say that only people, with a condition can write about that condition, or only people who are immigrants can write about immigration. But you need to have people in the room to have that conversation with, and be able to have, some sense of coherence and some sense of authenticity to what you're talking about. So, as I mentioned, I joined as Director of Communications. We were in office for a while, and that's kind of when COVID hit, and that obviously that changed everything. Although it was it was less disruptive to us than it would have been to some other organizations, because our whole model was to recruit people from all around the country. An online community where people could comment, could answer questions. We had questions every day for people with diabetes. Polling them. We had the research portal was all online. And so we were fortunate in that we were able to continue operations pretty smoothly for a while, just, with just the internet. And, that also spoke fortunately, to a lot of my experience, which was primarily web writing. I mean, I would say conservatively 98% of the writing I've done in my life, has been for the web, because there's just not as much, emphasis on print and physical media as there was, although there's still obviously a need for it. So, I learned a lot about, how to build a community there, how to sustain a community, ways that what you can do that will harm a community, and both in the sense of, things that upset people, but also just, it's kind of like a garden, a community that you have online. It requires tending. It requires a little bit of pruning sometimes. If you've got trolls, you do get trolls. It requires, but it requires attention and care. And if that's neglected, if you, for example, you lose your social media coordinator, and then they're not replaced quickly, you can see a line going down of engagement, of interest, and and those things are important, because once it starts to fall off, you wind up in a tougher place. And it's, again, some of the ways I talk about this may sound a bit corporate, and I did spend a while in the corporate world, but I mean, you still want people to pay attention. You want people to care, and you use a lot of the same tools. You just use them in different ways, to sort of manage these communities and then engage them, so you can get what you really want to need, which in the case of type 1 diabetes was advocacy, was research, and was engagement, and being able to communicate with the people who provide the services that ultimately we needed to survive: insulin, insulin pumps, glucose monitors, those kinds of things. It also introduced some. Sorry, the sun is coming in. It also introduced some interesting things that I hadn't dealt with before, which was how to manage competing interests and competing priorities at the nonprofit level. Because while moving to a cause-based organization, and one that was related to an experience or a condition that I'd had my whole life, was a major improvement, there were new challenges to kind of tackle, when you're working in cause-based organizations and nonprofits. Your funding has to come from somewhere, and so then you have to have conversations that can be difficult conversations about how do you balance the priorities of the funders, both spoken and unspoken, because, when you have a grant, the grant usually has certain riders, it has certain, things you have to meet. And then also sometimes there's politics that gets involved. And you have to have a conversation about, okay, well, just for example, Eli Lilly has given us a grant to study the use of, a new kind of insulin. Okay, that's great. We can reach out. But now on the editorial side, I want to run an article about a woman who passed away because of an insulin shortage. And, then sometimes you have to go and have a conversation with someone and say, look, I mean, they may not be thrilled about this, but this is the truth that's happening out there. And I think that, it's important to try and to stand by your guns when, as much as possible with that kind of thing. And we did ultimately end up running the story, which I was happy about. But it's just something to be aware of, that, when you enter into the nonprofit space, when you enter into this kind of world, that like these conversations can crop up, and you may not have been expecting them, but they will happen, because there can be these instances where, what the organization is trying to do on one side, like say fundraising, is at odds with what it's doing in terms of its mission, or its goals, or its day-to-day operations. And so, I hope, hopefully it's not a big part of anyone's life is dealing with these things, but it was something that, I became aware of, and I was like, you need to, know that can happen, and that might happen coming in. So as I mentioned, I was there, the pandemic began, obviously that changed a lot, but, we were able to keep going for a while there, and then they restructured, so I left Type 1 Diabetes Exchange, but I was able to find a position here at MIRA earlier this year. And so this has been a really fantastic experience for me, because I have not previously had a chance to work directly with the political structure here in the Commonwealth, and also at the federal level. And I think that that's one of the things that's really great about MIRA, is that it's an organization founded back in the 80s, actually, and it's been evolving ever since, and growing and adding more members. But, one of the benefits of being a coalition is that you get all of these different angles and avenues to access people, to access priorities, to, connect with people, and really like have conversations with politicians, people who can enact policy change. You can, we've even worked in helping politicians write, like for example, an op-ed that supports, a policy position that they've advocated for, that we also support. And so we can do that. We can also, organize at a local level to, sort of pressure politicians to say, hey, a lot of your community are immigrants, or are, in immigrant communities, or are in refugee communities. And here's why, for example, the Safe Communities Act is really important, or here's why the Workforce and Family Mobility Act are really important. Those are two pieces of legislation that we're working on getting passed through the Massachusetts Senate, and hopefully the governor's office right now, which deal with the way that law enforcement tackles, or rather, keeping law enforcement from being inappropriately involved with immigration sort of enforcement and detention, and also making informed consent, more important, so that people don't get kind of don't show up to the courthouse, pay a fine, and then get roped into an ICE, detention situation, or there's the pandemic is actually a perfect example of why this is so important, because in a lot of immigrant communities, people were afraid to get vaccinated because there was this fear that if they showed up to a vaccine site, ICE might be there, and they might detain an immigrant, and the rules were that, you don't have to have an ID, you don't have to show any documentation, you don't have to do anything but show up and say, I'm eligible for the vaccine. But, there's also the language barrier that can show up. There's, the fear was not necessarily based in something that was always going to happen, but it could happen. And it was a severe enough consequence that it kept, a lot of immigrant communities from seeking the vaccine, and still does. And so we're hoping that this act, the Safe Communities Act, will, do something to alleviate that. But it's also a multi-step process. It's not just, lobbying. It's not just, talking to politicians, but you have to lobby. You have to work with local groups. You have to communicate it out to the groups, because, you have to if it becomes law, then you have to let people in different, in the Spanish speaking community know, in the Portuguese speaking community know, in the Haitian Creole speaking community know. And so there's a whole second wave of once you get the policy proposals, once and if you get the policy proposals you want passed, then you need to bring it to the communities that it affects, because understandably, a lot of people have a mistrust of the government, and the the sort of the structures there. And so there's a question here. So that's a great question, Irma. And I didn't know you got to work on legislation. That's very cool.
And just for those watching later, I'll read the question. So in your role, how did you go about that, reducing fear in such a hectic time like COVID?
Right. So I should say, I should caveat that I joined, like I said, back in March. So I was not a part of MIRA during like the darkest steps of the pandemic, as it were. But the way that the coalition did manage it was actually to form with a number of other groups, a couple of different focus working groups and coalitions on that. So there's something called the Vaccine Equity Now Coalition, which joins together some of our member organizations, as well as people like groups and organizations that work for Black and Brown communities in Boston and in Massachusetts, some faith-based organizations, because that's one of the best ways to reach communities that are hard to sort of talk to through conventional channels, as it were. And also just for the foreign language papers. There's actually a lot of foreign language papers in Massachusetts that serve specific communities. New Bedford has a couple of ones that are just Portuguese for the Brazilian, Azorean, and Portuguese communities down there. And so building a coalition with them to communicate facts about the virus, facts about protection, and then once it became the next phase, facts about vaccination, sort of myth busting kind of things, like what you need to know, what's true, what isn't true, where to go. We worked a lot with the Whittier Health Center, which is one of the big organizations in Boston that's been doing mobile clinics to sort of, not everyone can make it to a vaccination center or haven't been able to, so bringing the vaccine to people where they are. So I think it's I think the main thing I've learned about it, honestly, is that it does take a coalition. It does take an approach that brings together lots of different people and lots of different groups, because it's impossible for any one group to do everything, and it's really a fool's errand to try and put all of your policy or all of your direct action eggs in one basket, because it's just not manageable, and it's just not really an effective strategy. It's much better to bring together the people who have been working in these communities, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, to say, okay, what do we need to do as a broad goal? Okay, well, we want people to get sick. We want people to get vaccinated. We want people to have access. We want people to know, the truth about, this or that. And so, but also there's also the issue of trust. I mean, you may have heard of the MIRA Coalition. You may not have, but on average, most people probably haven't. But you have heard your pastor talk. You have heard your local union leader talk. So being able to get someone like there are a couple of unions that they have, the SEIU, and so that's like the Service Workers Union. So your union chief who is able to speak to what your day-to-day concerns working in at Encore. You wash dishes at Encore, or you wash, you work in the laundry at the Hyatt. You may have a specific set of questions, and you probably trust that person more than you trust some random person. And so recruiting those people in is super important. So I've talked a lot, but yeah, I would love to take any questions, or if people have any questions about any aspect of my work now or MIRA or my career, I'm happy to hear them.
This is wonderful, Daniel. Thank you. I'll just pause the recording before we do questions so that the people who joined us since can start the video for now and open it back up. Irma, you'd asked some powerful questions, and I also want to acknowledge what was in the chat for those who can't see it, that you said you got to work on the Safe Communities Act. And that's great to see the connections made around this work too. So
we're this close to getting it passed.
Yeah, honestly, I will say the one thing. Well, first, thank you for being here. I feel like the work that you're doing is so important, and obviously MIRA as well. But I found, like, in the thesis that I wrote, it came back to the Safe Communities Act and how much COVID really impacted everything that's happening right now. So I just think it's really interesting how a lot of the advocacy work has centered back to the COVID-19 pandemic and how much it's facilitated the legislative process in terms of getting things on top of the agenda that previously when I worked on it in, I believe it was like 2019, we had a really hard time trying to convince legislators to get on board with this. So I'm really excited to see where things go in terms of this policy. And you know, I just want to keep encouraging you to keep doing your thing and, you know, put pressure on the people who hold positions of power, because honestly, at the end of the day, it's them that are making decisions for a lot of community members across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So I just wanted to praise the work that you are all doing. And I'll keep doing that, honestly. I have a lot of love and respect for people in the MIRA Coalition, because without the work that you all are doing, honestly, a lot of the policies would not be where they are today.
I can't take too much credit for it, but I'll let them know.
Well, I think people may be thinking of other questions. I wanted to touch it on something you mentioned, Daniel. We have a lot of fellows who either started in the private sector and are thinking of switching to the nonprofit sector, or started in the nonprofit sector and maybe want to stay there but want to venture in and try the for-profit sector for a while and just get different experiences and bring them together. So in addition to the learnings that you shared about what you took from each sector, I was wondering if there was anything more you wanted to add on your own navigation in between those sectors.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a challenge writing new cover letters, new resumes, and kind of figuring out, like, okay, I've been doing this for, been doing the private sector thing for a long time. How do I approach people who are in a different, sector, part of the social structure, and say, hey, like, I want to work with you. I care a lot about this. I think that, one of the best things you can do is just talk to people, who are, have been there, or who are already there, and say, what is it that you would look for? If you were hiring a new, development director, if you were hiring a new, communications associate, like, for your, whatever nonprofit you worked at, what would you want to see? And, just ask people what they want, because, it probably changes. 6-8 years ago, no one would have cared if you knew how to use Instagram. But now if you're working in communications, and like every nonprofit has to have, like, Instagram presence to sort of build its profile in that space. So, like, learning what people want and need is super important. I think that there's also ways to build up what it means. This takes time, this takes energy, but most nonprofit organizations have a burning, desperate need for some kind of contribution, whether it's beyond the financial, obviously, but for content, for engagement, for volunteering. And so if you can take some of your time and drive it toward that, so let's say you really want to work in the environmental nonprofit sector, but you haven't been working in something that's related to that. Well, you can still write, for places that are looking for, contributions. Sometimes you can get paid for it. You can still volunteer for, nonprofit, environmental nonprofits that are doing, work in your local area. And that can help say, when you go to apply for a job, you can point to those things and say, I haven't just done this one thing. I've done these other things as well, and make sure that you emphasize, how and why you've done that. And I mean, I think the other thing is to be able to think about it logically. And, there are things that are really different between nonprofit work and for-profit work, but there's things that are also very, very similar. And you can, it may seem like a different world if you're on one side of the bar or on the other, but I mean, everyone's managing projects. I mean, project management is one of those terms that's like so broad that it covers a lot of different things, but you still have to come up with ideas, plan them, execute them, sometimes delegate them, sometimes, edit them and produce them. And I'm speaking from a content creation perspective, which is most of what I've done, writing, editing, publishing, getting things out there, getting people engaged, and then managing the analysis of it. But a lot of times, what you're actually doing is actually pretty similar on a day-to-day basis. It's just different words and different pictures and different people you're talking to. That those skills are transferable. So you just explain to, whoever you're talking to, whether it's a hiring manager or, someone who you're having a conversation with over lunch, like I got really good at project management at my private sector job, and I've transferred those project management skills to my new job because, whether it's a campaign to petition legislators to take a different approach or an ad campaign, a lot of the pieces are similar. Some are really different. There's some very different considerations, but it's a lot of times more similar than you might think. And explaining that to people can be helpful if they haven't, crossed that barrier before. Also, get really good at using Google Sheets, Google Docs. Google Docs and Google Sheets are like the things that have saved my hide more times than I can count in my career, because being able to pull up some hard numbers about something and being able to, not lose a draft because it's an autosave is just, I cannot overstate how useful they've been in my career at every position I've ever had, basically.
Well, we're appreciating your words of wisdom at the overall level and at the technical level. I do want to honor time, but also just see if anyone else on the call has one other question or thought for Daniel or the group.
Diverse coalition, and definitely something that comes up a lot. I think the first thing is just to ask questions. Just ask questions in the spirit of genuine and generous inquiry. Like, what, and by questions I don't mean like, why does your culture do this or something like that, but what is the best way for me to approach this? What is the best way for me to approach, for example, just a quick example is that before I came to MIRA, I had never used I had never been in an organization where people were asked to put their pronouns in their bio at the beginning of meetings. And I just asked, okay, well, what's, I've never done this before, but you just, let me know like what the policy is, what the, or what not the policy is, but like what the, what the standard is here, what's expected, what should I do, where is it appropriate? And then just, also try to listen to the people who have been there or been in these spaces the longest. I mean, one of the things that we also do in a lot of our meetings is use the progressive stack, and again, a lot of this is now informed by how we interact on Zoom all the time, but putting things in the chat so that it can be held and moderated in a way that acknowledges privilege and acknowledges the sort of different positions that people are coming at this from. So I'm still learning a lot of this stuff, and I think that the best thing to do is to come at it with an open mind, to ask questions, and to take criticism or correction, with the knowledge that you are new to something. If you were new to learning an instrument, you wouldn't get angry at your music teacher for telling you that, this is how you should, hold this chord or something. And so I don't think people should get annoyed when they're told like, hey, here's how you should enter this group, because, the people in this group might have been doing it for 30 years. You've been doing it for 3 months. So you should, keep an open mind and keep a generous mind when it comes to, if you are at some point told like, hey, this is actually the way you should do this. It's learning a new dynamic, I guess, if that helps.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel. That's great.
Well, thank you for your questions, everyone. Thank you, Daniel, for your time. It's wonderful that as someone in cause-based work and who is a Brandeis alum, you said, I like what I'm hearing about the Segal program, and I'm happy to share my career journey. So we really appreciate having time with you. I see some things coming in from the chat as well. And just to commemorate this wonderful, for anyone who does want to take their video off, nobody who's driving or biking has to do that. I'll take a quick group picture on the screen grab before.
Sorry I ran a little long. But it was great to hear your questions, to be able to share this with you. Hopefully it was helpful. I put my email in the chat, deepedit@miracoalition.org. And like I said, we have opportunities, both volunteer and full-time opportunities. And also just some events that may be coming up. So if you go to our website, you can check those out. But thanks for listening to me, and I appreciate all of your time today.
Thanks so much, everyone, for being here, and Daniel for sharing your wisdom and experience. Great to see you guys.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie.